It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Well, here we are. This is the end of the Universal Classic Monster series for Monster Mondays. Originally, the cycle, as it was called, because the sequels for the monsters were kind of cyclical in the way that they were released, came to an end in 1945 with the release of House of Dracula. That is, of course, barring if you want to include either The Werewolf of London and its sort of possible sequel, She-Wolf of London, and the Abbott and Costello movies, which I technically don't include any of those. But then, after The Creature from the Black Lagoon was extremely popular and he was made kind of an adjunct member of the classic monster series, the new timeline ended after the release of 1956's The Creature Walks Among Us. There are still many more monster movies of this era, and especially from Universal, over the course of about 30 years that I can pick from. But this episode brings both the multi-franchise that was Universal's classic monster series and made that every monster kid's favorite studio, and it also brings 2024 to a close as well. Now, we're going to talk about the final entry in the saga of The Invisible Man. This movie is The Invisible Man's Revenge. This was the fifth film in that specific franchise. When looking at all the franchises under the, what I call the multi-franchise banner of the Universal Classic Monsters, The Invisible Man, The Mummy, and Dracula all got 5 films, with Frankenstein getting 7. And if you do wish to include Werewolf of London and She-Wolf of London, The Wolfman and the other werewolves got 6 films. Again, it does kind of come down to if you want to include those other 2 werewolf movies in the franchise. But the beautiful 30 films set that Universal put out onto Blu-ray some years ago, they do include those as well as the Abbott and Costello movies, but it's totally up to you if you want to actually say those are official members of the whole Universal Classic Monster series. But each franchise does something different. For the most part, the Frankenstein and the Wolfman films were the most linear and continuity driven. There's a specific path that leads from 1931's Frankenstein to its original sequels, to 1941's The Wolfman, and to where they meet and get into like the House of duology, the House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula. Dracula was kind of all over the place because Bela Lugosi never came back to reprise the role. In the movies, Dracula had a daughter. Then Lon Chaney Jr. played him, and then John Carradine stepped into the cloak for 2 films. There really is no true continuity beyond Dracula and Dracula's daughter, picking right up from the end of the first Dracula movie. The Mummy was really tight with continuity, except for the first film. We had 2 different mummies in those 5 films. The Mummy films of the 40s are really only sequels to themselves, as the 1932 masterpiece is nothing like those more adventurous movies of the 40s. And then there's the Invisible Man series. Each of these movies featured a different Invisible Man, and each one is kind of a different type of movie. We have the original that seems to kind of have a similar tone to the H.G. Wells source material, even if it separates itself into its own thing. Kind of seemingly taking place in a village, kind of a secluded place that doesn't seem as technologically advanced in terms of the era or the years that it was happening in. The second felt much more modern and kind of sequel-y, and the third was a comedy. And by the time The Invisible Agent and The Invisible Man's Revenge came out, the war was raging, and it made sense to tie one of those movies to World War II in some way, while making the other a kind of crime thriller that deals with blackmail and betrayal. This entry brings John Hall back for another Invisible Man movie, but he's not playing the same character as he did in the previous entry, The Invisible Agent. Now, John Carradine appears in this movie as well. Ford Beebe is our director here, and notably, he wrote and or directed some 200 pictures over the course of 60 years. He did a lot of serials, which I think will kind of serve him well for this movie. Yeah, because they're very fast paced, very kind of episodic, and the scenes of this movie kind of feel episodic in some ways, just very much so condensed into a 77-minute movie instead of several episodes of, 10 or 15 minutes long over the course of several parts. But the serials he did were popular ones like Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, The Green Hornet. The notable serial he made that featured a key figure that was played by one of the Universal's greatest was The Phantom Creeps that starred Bela Lugosi. It's clear that Beebe was an efficient and competent director, and behind the camera as cinematographer, we have a pretty big deal here, and that's Milton Krasner. Now, Krasner shot other Universal monster flicks, but he had just come off an Oscar nomination for Best Cinematography for Arabian Nights. He'd be nominated for 7 Oscars in all, and then won in 1955 for 3 Coins in a Fountain. All right, so let's get into this final film in the Universal Classic Monster stable, at least according to this show and me. We start with Robert Griffin. Now, of course, that's one thing that did stay mostly true throughout the series of the Invisible Man movies. Robert Griffin is the last name of the original Invisible Man, and typically there would be a guy in the movies that also shared that name. But he's a rather nervous man. He arrived in London after stowing away on a ship in a cargo container. He purchases a new outfit and leaves his old clothes with the tailor. And the tailor discovered that Griffin is an escapee from an insane asylum in Cape Town. Elsewhere, we meet the Herricks, a well-to-do family. There is Sir Jasper Herrick and his wife, Lady Irene, and their daughter, Julie. Now, they are meeting Julie's journalist boyfriend, Mark, for the first time. And when the couple leaves, Griffin is kind of watching from the bushes, and he is specifically seeking out Sir Jasper and Lady Irene. Jasper and Irene are quite surprised to hear that Robert Griffin has arrived to see them. The 3 of them were in a jungle some years ago, and Robert was suddenly knocked out by what Irene says was a falling tree branch. They claim that they were told that Robert was killed. Now, Robert doesn't really believe the story. He wonders if maybe perhaps one of the, whether it was Irene or Jasper, struck him with the branch instead of it just innocently falling. It's left a little vague. I tend to believe the Herricks in this case, because Robert, throughout the course of the movie, the way he acts about things and the way he deals with certain things, I kind of feel like he is actually kind of making that up, and that really what they said happened is what happened. But 5 years passed with Griffin not knowing who he was or what happened. He was working at a dock or on a construction site or something. I can't remember exactly what he said, but he was struck again in the head, and that's when his memories return. He ended up spending some time in an insane asylum and killed 3 orderlies in order to escape. And then he came here to get his full share of this expedition, which was kind of involving a mine with various jewels and stuff inside. But however, the Herricks say they don't have his share. They actually invested it in bad deals. Robert says he wants all the Herricks' money, or he'll go to the police to tell them that they tried to kill him. Irene says they will compensate him some way, and she gets him a drink, and it's not long before the truth is out that drink has been drugged. When Robert passes out, Irene tells Jasper they need to get rid of him. It may not be true that they killed him, or tried to kill him, but they can't deal with a potential controversy around them. So basically, she's like, he's clearly a madman. He's here for revenge. We got to get rid of him. After all, he believes that they did try to kill him, and she's not going to let him ruin them or drag their daughter down with them, who he believes he's also owed as well as compensation. And by the way, it should be mentioned that Julie and Robert have never met each other either. She has no idea who Robert Griffin is. She has never met him personally. So for him to also say, oh yeah, you owe me your daughter too, that's pretty ballsy, Bob. But when Robert comes to outside the Herrick's property, he falls into a river, but is saved by a wino named Herbert Higgins, who gives him a place to get dry and warmed. Then he learns of this conspiracy, and Herbert is excited to help Robert for a handsome reward. The problem is that the Herricks took the piece of paper that proves that the two of them had an agreement. So Herbert and Griffin get a lawyer who basically basically gives them the deal of, we're going to settle this out of court for a large sum of money. But Herricks knows the chief constable, who says Herbert and Robert Griffin are trying to blackmail the Herricks. The chief constable, named Travers, tells the wino to tell Griffin to get out of his jurisdiction or he will be arrested. Griffin is heading out of town to go to London, but in this rainstorm that's going on, Griffin is forced to seek shelter, and he comes to the home of Dr. Peter Drury, who, one, is happy to give shelter to Griffin, since he's not looking too hot, and he is a doctor after all. And two, Drury gets excited when he learns that Griffin is a fugitive. So soon, Griffin realizes that Drury is a bit of a mad scientist who has invisible subjects that he's experimented on. Drury has discovered the invisibility formula, and he gives Robert a bunch of scientific mumbo-jumbo to explain how he can change the molecular makeup of physical tissue to turn something invisible. He started with small animals and began working upward from there. And the biggest animal he's been able to do anything with up to this point was his pet dog. But Griffin decides to become Drury's next test subject. After all, either this will work or he will die. So he's not really got anything to lose. And if it works, he can use this to get back at the Herricks. But Griffin gets the shot of the formula, and it does indeed work. He goes invisible, and he plans to use this to basically get back at the Herricks to get what was coming to them. And Drury wanted him to stay so that he can show this off to the press, answer questions, do a demonstration, but Griffin has zero interest in sticking around and being a guinea pig. He's got business of his own to do, so he tosses Drury aside and goes to the Herricks, where he removes his clothing so that he can taunt Jasper while he is invisible. So basically, Griffin wants Jasper's money, his house, and his daughter, and he forces Jasper to write a confession that he twice tried to murder Griffin. And to make things right, this confession will include what he will give to Griffin as recompense, basically. So as Griffin reads over the confession, Jasper tries hitting him with a chair, but Griffin stops him. And when Irene comes in and discovers the confession, she intends to tear it up, but Jasper begs her not to. And to prove that he is in the room with the Herricks, he puts some water on, Griffin puts some water from the fish tank onto his face to show himself, and then he takes off with the confession. Now later, Griffin meets back up with Herbert, and they go to the pub, because Griffin needs a place to operate out of, and Herbert has his little shack, but he's about to lose it because he can't afford the rent. So Griffin helps Herbert hustle some patrons at a game of darts to help pay for his rent. He also taunts Mark by whispering to him, while he's not able to be seen, that Julie is not for him. Julie has called off a date with Mark because her mother is in hysterics about the invisible man named Griffin. The butler tells Mark that there was a man named Griffin there the other night. And Griffin is in the house and tries to push a sculpture from the second floor, landing on the butler, but Mark saves him. Griffin then tells Jasper that he wants Julie for himself, and if he doesn't get her, he will kill him. And he says he'll come back and get his answer about his daughter and all the other stuff he wants. But he first stops off at Drury's, where he witnesses the doctor discovering how to make his dog visible again by way of a blood transfusion. Griffin demands that Drury make him visible again, but you see, there's a catch. The transfusion is a complete and total transfusion. That dog that made Drury's dog visible again died. And Griffin says that that's not a problem. In fact, he knows whose blood that they can drain, and that would be Mark's. However, Drury tricks Griffin, and instead of calling Mark to come over to get us the exclusive about capturing the Invisible Man, Drury called the police instead. But when the police calls back to check on this suspicious call from Drury's phone number, Griffin says Drury will have to do that, will have to do for that blood that he needs for tricking him. So he does the transfusion, which makes him visible again, and it kills Drury. Just to make matters worse, Drury could have been saved because Mark comes into the police station to ask about any inquiries about the Invisible Man, only to wait for the cops to finish playing a game of cribbage before telling Mark that someone did indeed call from Drury's about the Invisible Man on the loose. And so at that point, Mark is like, come on, we got to go and figure this out because I want the scoop for the newspaper. And, well, you got to stop this guy who's killing people. But when they, when they get to the place, Griffin has burned down Drury's lab, which means that the invisible formula will no longer be found. And basically the whole place is trashed. Now, Griffin returns to the Herricks and tells Jasper that he will now go by Martin Field so that now that he's visible again, you can say, hey, he's my old friend, Martin Field. And as long as nobody knows who Robert Griffin was, this will pass. And he's also there to take possession of Jasper's wealth, house, and soon Julie. But Griffin is haunted by Drury's dog, who chased him to Jasper's and keeps howling outside the mansion. So Griffin tells Herbert that he'll give him £1,000 if he kills the dog and then gets lost. And Griffin's visibility starts to fade again while having breakfast with Mark, Julie, and Jasper. And Griffin tricks Mark to go into the cellar, where he then knocks Mark out to do another transfusion. But before that transfusion can kill Mark, the Chief Constable Travers breaks in and Drury's dog attacks and kills Griffin right there in the wine cellar. So let's talk about 3 things that I liked about The Invisible Man's Revenge. First, I really do like John Carradine in this movie. He's kind of a quack, but also a kind of a serious one. Like, what he's doing is bizarre and peculiar, and it's sometimes you do wonder exactly why do you want an invisibility formula. However, he is actually truly accomplished, but at the same time, he also lives alone. His neighbors are not willing to stay too close to him, and he finds out that he's quite excited when Griffin comes to his door, especially because he's a fugitive. That gives this person a reason to want to be his human test subject. But Carradine is always nice to see in a movie. He's friendly with that hint of madness. It is kind of, I do feel sad what happens to him in the movie when he ultimately meets his demise, and his poor dog keeps howling and barking at Griffin for what he's been, what he did to Drury. It kind of gets you in the feels a little bit. Next, I really do like that the Invisible Man in this isn't a misunderstood guy who went crazy from the formula or is an actual hero of the Americans fighting the Nazis in World War II. Instead, he really is kind of a vengeful bad guy. Sure, the Herricks seemingly either orchestrated the accident that caused Robert Griffin to lose his memory and spend 5 years not knowing who he is or what happened to him, or they are trying to wiggle out of the deal that they had together to share, as far as giving him his share after they found the gems and all of the stuff that they were looking for in the jungle 5 years earlier. But Sure. I mean, neither of those things really land the Herricks in the best of light, but Griffin is crazed about getting revenge on them. That makes him a different type of character in this. He's greedy. He's vengeful. He wants to torture the Herricks for cutting him out. That makes him something of a swindler, and it also kind of gives him this desperation about his character that makes him that much more dangerous. And lastly, I did want to save a like for the Universal Classic Monster series as a whole. Naturally, all my life these monsters were around, be it Dracula or Frankenstein or a mummy or a Wolfman. They've been represented in cartoons, comic books, TV shows, movies, and even on cereal boxes. But these monsters, these were monsters that I knew about and even knew specific moments from the movies, even if I'm not sure when I would have seen those movies for the first time, especially when I was little, but you always saw clips from them. He's alive, all of that stuff. Those are burned into pop culture memory. So, while I maybe didn't see the movies when I was a kid, I knew that moment. I knew what the reference was to say he's alive, and, Noah's talking about Frankenstein's monster. And even the Invisible Man walking around in the trench coat and bandages is an image I cannot tell you the first time I saw it. I just know that it was there. I had mentioned at some point in the past, but it was my oldest brother, Jim, who kind of indirectly introduced me to the movies. When we both worked at a video store in the mid-90s, he made sure to have as many of the movies released on VHS back then in the 90s as possible available to rent, which also meant that we could watch the movies while working, especially in the fall and on less than busy weekday afternoons. It was probably 1996 or 97 when I first began watching these and taking an interest in them. And on top of that, occasionally the Sci-Fi Channel would also show some of these. These movies are kind of part of a fond memory of that time and the discovery of these old black and white classics. I never felt fear or horror while watching these monster movies, but instead, I have a way of feeling kind of calm and, what's more, appreciation while watching them. The black and white photography, the music, the gothic styles of some of the movies, or just the settings of the other movies, if it were, the flowery dialogue in some of the movies, and the actors who were involved just kind of presented this lovely warm blanket for me that I like to curl up into from time to time. I wish more of these movies got played on TV these days, but that's maybe more of a subject for another time that's not really appropriate here for Monster Mondays. But what these movies represent to me is the changing of seasons from summer to fall and the incoming Halloween season. Whenever I do like horror movie watches in October, I always make sure to include at least a few of the Universal Classic Monsters. They're that essential to the season for me. And in time, I will be covering more of the Universal horror and thriller movies released in the 40s and 50s that sometimes did get released with these more recognizable monster movies in various VHS collections. There are plenty more, including like Werewolf of London and She-Wolf of London, that should get their day on here. Naturally, there are also some Abbott and Costello movies featuring the monsters too, though I'm not a huge fan of those movies and that duo. I am sort of feeling nostalgic as I close this chapter of Monster Monday, so maybe I should watch them and do episodes for each of those, but time will ultimately tell. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Also, don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast each Wednesday morning and Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Now that we've closed the chapter on one longtime series that's been featured here on Monster Mondays, next week, we begin closing the chapter of another one. For January 2025, I've decided it's time to wrap up the final 4 Showa-era Godzilla films, beginning with All Monsters Attack. So until next week, have a safe and happy new year, and stay spooky.